Right. It was mentioned in the that was mentioned in the Alter Shulchan Aruch with respect to vinegar being strong enough that it bubbles when you hit the ground. That was the, if I remember correctly, that was the barometer for when it is totally exempt, because it's in. But he didn't mention anything about right. But the implication from the Gemara was that there is a possibility where you drink a little, right? Because you made a distinction between when did I say you're allowed to, only if it's when did I say you're not exempt if this is a little. So it's a higher. It's not the same measure of the rest of liquids. A different measure. It's a measure for when it becomes. Okay, I have to look in the Shulchan Aruch again. Okay. So I meant the Alter Shulchan Aruch. It's probably possibly in there. Okay. All right. Shkoyach. If it's something you enjoy or not. Okay. We are on the top of Pei Beis Amud Aleph 82a. We begin the section where the Gemara discusses the law of when we begin to encourage children to observe Yom Kippur by fasting. God willing, we'll finish this section today. And tomorrow we'll look at the Alter Shulchan Aruch on these laws. And then from there we get on to the law of pregnant women and the women who and people who are sick, and when and how they can break their fast on Yom Kippur. So that will come in 2 days, God willing. Okay, so top of the page. Hatinoikos, children, we do not compel them to fast on Yom Kippur. They're children, they're minors, they aren't responsible to fulfill mitzvahs yet, and therefore we don't compel them to do mitzvahs. However, there is an obligation, even a biblical one, to educate our children, which is an interesting phenomenon, in that this is a discussion in of itself, the child's obligation to observe whatever mitzvahs you are obligated to teach them is then an extension of your obligation, or it's their individualized obligation. But there's still an obligation to educate. So when it comes to fasting, when does that start? It comes to other things. Torah study begins when the child is able to speak, and you slowly begin to teach the child more as he gets older. So at what point is a child strong enough to be able to fast? And therefore, says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, Avabat, they are acclimated, trained, educated to begin fasting. It doesn't say exactly how long they're fasting for. A whole day, part of the day, we'll get to that in the Gemara. But at this point, the Mishnah just states, we train them, lefnei shana, prior to 1 year, lefnei shnatayim, and prior to 2 years. I translated it literally that way for a specific reason, as we'll see in the Gemara, because it's not exactly clear how many years before the age of adulthood, 12 for a girl and 13 for a boy, does the Mishnah mean right here. But literally translated, the Gemara the Mishnah says, prior to a year and prior to 2 years. So that they become more accustomed to doing mitzvahs. Okay, so 2-3 years prior, that's when they begin to get educated. So first the Gemara makes a comment before the Gemara gets into what exactly this means when we say prior to 1 year and prior to 2 years. Does that mean 1 year in advance and 2 years in advance? Or does it mean 2 years and 3 years in advance? If I say prior to a year, that either means the year preceding or it means 2 years preceding, because it's prior to a year. Prior to a year would be the closest to the year before, which would be 2 years before. And if I say prior to 2 years, that would be 3 years before. Or does it mean literally just a year in advance, 2 years in advance? So it's two ways to translate it, prior to a year or a year in advance. We'll get to that soon. But before the Gemara gets that, you clear on that distinction? So before the Gemara gets that, first the Gemara comments on the fact that the Gemara gives two times. Lefnei shana, prior to a year and prior to 2 years. Well, which one is it? And if the Gemara asks, hashta now b'fnei shtayim mechanchen lahu, if you're telling us in the end that prior to 2 years, one begins educating the child, then b'fnei shana, prior to a year, do you have to tell me that? You told me already prior to 2 years. Then obviously prior to 1 year, I'm going to be educating them. I'm not going to do an education and stop and then get back to teach. Then that would be counterintuitive, counterproductive. So if the Mishnah already concludes by saying, L'fnei shnatayim, prior to 2 years, then that includes within it the prior to a year. Why state both? Clear? Says the Gemara, Rav Chizda says, like Kasha, this is not a contradiction. Haba chayla, one is talking about a child who is weaker. Literally, chayla means ill, but we'll learn from the Shulchan Aruch, it doesn't mean literally ill, it means just weaker child in general. So a child is weaker, begins prior to a year. Habibari, a child that's more healthy, that's stronger, prior to 2 years. So the two measures, the two times in the Mishnah are not for the same person. They're actually for two different people. The weaker child starts a little later, and the healthier child starts a little earlier. Okay, so this was Rav Chizda's way of understanding the Mishnah. The next two opinions are really one. They're two different people speaking, but they're one opinion. First, talking about a girl. The next, talking about a boy, but they're really the same opinion. Right? Because a boy and a girl become adults a year apart. A girl at 12 and a boy at 13. So that each of the next two statements are going to be one about girl, one about boy, but they're really the same opinion because in terms of how many years prior to becoming an adult the process begins, they'll agree. It's just a question of a year later when you're talking about a boy. But the two next statements, Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, are in disagreement with Rav Chizda, as we shall see. Or could be seen as a contradiction to Rav Nachman as well, as Rav Chizda, as we'll see. Rav Huna states, Ben Ches, an 8-year-old child who is healthy, girl, 8-year-old girl who's healthy. That means she's going into her 9th year. She's already completed 8 years. Ben Tes, and a 9-year-old girl who is healthy. I'm learning this Gemara like Rashi does. Some others learn this differently, but we're learning like Rashi. An 8-year-old girl who is healthy and a 9-year-old girl who's weaker. They begin to be educated to fast for a few hours. So now we've already got a little bit of a definition of what it means to educate a child. The Mishnah just said we begin to educate them either prior to a year or prior to 2 years. Now, Rav Huna is the first one who introduces the idea that what does educating the children mean? It means to teach them to fast for a few hours. Don't skip breakfast. Wait until 11 to eat. Just practice postponing their eating or fasting for hours. Doesn't say how many hours, and I guess it would depend on the parent-child relationship and the child's condition. But you begin at the age of 8 for a healthy girl, and the age of 9 for a weaker girl, to teach them to fast for hours. Now, Ben Yud, a girl who's healthy and is 10 years old, or Ben Yud Aleph, or a girl who is weaker and she's 11, Mashlimim Midrabanan, she begins to fast the entirety of the 25-hour fast, not biblically speaking, because she isn't biblically obligated in any commandments until she's 12, but she'll do so rabbinically. So according to Rav Huna, this is what it comes out. There's 2 tracks. The healthy track and there's the weaker track. The healthier girl begins to fast biblically, obviously, at 12. Rabbinically, at 11 and 10. And she begins to train at 8. At 8. So 2 years training. She's a healthy child. 2 years training, 2 years full fasting rabbinically, and then 1 year, and then she starts to fast biblically. If she is not as healthy, so we have 2 years training, 9 and 10, 1 year fasting rabbinically, 11, and then she begins to fast at 12 because she's 12 and she has to fast. Clear? Okay. Which is Yud Beis Mashlim and Daraisa. Once she hits 12, she starts to begin to fast biblically, but Tekinoikos when you're talking about a young girl. So there's either 4 years of training, if she's healthy, 2 years 2 years partial fast, 1 year full fast, or there's 4 years of training. 2 years partial fast, 2 years complete fast rabbinically, and then she begins to fast biblically. Clear? Now, Rav Nachman says the exact same thing with respect to a boy, but starting a year later. Rav Nachman says, Ben Tess, a healthy boy begins fasting at 9 years old for hours. Ben Yud, if he unhealthy, not as strong, a weaker boy, begins training at 10, and his training is to fast for a few hours. Ben Yud Aleph, if the child is healthy, so he's been doing partial fast for 2 years now, since he's 9. Now he's 11 years old, he does an entire fast. Ben Yud Beis, and if the child's not as healthy, so he's also been doing 2 years of training since he was 10, then now he's 12 years old. Mashlimin D'Rabbanan, he does a complete fast rabbinically. Ben Yud Gimel, once he's 13, Mashlimin D'Raisa, he does an entire fast by biblical obligation. B'Tinuk, with respect, this is all with respect to a young boy. So again, 2 tracks, either 3 years of training, 2 years partial fast, 1 year, 2 years partial fast, which is 9, 10. I'm sorry, 10, 11. And then a complete fast rabbinically, that's 12 years old. That's if the child is weaker. If the child is healthier, this boy is healthier, then there's 2 years of training for hours at the ages of 9 and 10. And then 2 years of rabbinic fasting, 11 and 12, and then 13 begins to fast. So both Rav Huna and Rav Nachman should agree that there are 2 options, either 4-year training or 3-year training, depending if it's a weaker child or a healthier child. And the difference between the 4-year and the 3-year is whether you have 1 year complete fast rabbinic or 2 years complete fast rabbinic. But they both agree that there are 2 years prior to the rabbinic fast in which they would do partial fasting as training. Clear? Okay. Sorry? Then, yeah, you have to acclimate. You can't just drop it on the child at once. That's the idea. Okay. Where am I? Okay. Rabbi Yochanan says, Hashlama d'Rabbanan leika. There's no such thing as making a child this is Rabbi Yochanan's view, there's no such thing as teaching a child to fast the entire day rabbinically prior to being 13 or 12 years old. Doesn't exist. The first complete fast the child does is the biblical obligation at 13 or at 12. This is Rabbi Yochanan's view. Whereas Rav Huna and Rav Nachman agreed that there's at least 1 year of rabbinic fasting prior to turning 12 or 13. And if the child's healthy, there's even 2 years of fasting a complete fast prior to biblical obligation. Rabbi Yochanan says there is no such thing as requiring a child to do a full fast prior to biblical obligation. Rather, what training is there? Says Rabbi Yochanan, Ben Yud Aleph, a 10-year-old or an 11-year-old, a healthy 10-year-old girl begins to start partial fasting at 10 and 11. A weaker young girl begins to do partial fast at 11. Then Yud Beis at 12. Mashlimim D'Raisa, she begins to fast biblically. So there's 2 big distinctions between Rabbi Yochanan and Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, both agree that there's at least 1 year of complete fasting before biblical command by rabbinic law for a child. Question is if it's healthy, 2 years, and if it's weaker, 1 year. That's distinction number 1. Distinction number 2 is that both Rav Nachman, under any circumstance, according to Rav Nachman and Rav Huna, whereas Rabbi Yochanan says that prior to biblical command, there is no complete fast. Distinction number 1. Distinction number 2 is that Rav Nachman and Rav Huna both agree that there is always 2 years of partial fasting prior to complete fasting, prior to the rabbinic complete fasting that they obligate. There's 2 years of partial fasting, whether it's a stronger child or a weaker child, irrespective. It's just a question of, when does that start? Does it start at 10 or does it start at 9? Does it start at 9 or start at 8? Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says only a healthy child gets 2 years of partial hour fasting, and a weaker child would only get 1 year of partial fasting. So you see these 2 distinctions? Distinction number 1 with respect to whether or not there is a complete fasting before biblical obligation. Distinction number 2 is whether or not there is a mandatory 2-year partial fasting in preparation for the complete fasting. Those are the 2 distinctions. We're going to focus now on the Second distinction. The issue of how many years is a child required to do partial fasting? According to Rabbi Yochanan, healthy, 2 years, weaker, 1 year. According to Rav Nachman and Rav Huna, always 2 years. The question is only when those 2 years start. Sorry? So it does leave it up to the parents, and that the parents have to decide whether the child is capable of doing this and whether the child's healthy or not. The guidelines are to begin doing so, and the Gemara is, let's take this. If your child's incapable of fasting, obviously you're not going to push them to fast, right? But one could have thought that until my child's 13, I don't have to encourage them to do anything. It says the Gemara, no, here's the optimum program of how you should encourage your child to do so. When we get to the actual code of Jewish law, we'll see what exactly we should encourage and what we shouldn't encourage. But at this point, we see that there is an obligation to encourage our children to practice fasting. And here's like the guidelines of what the expectation of your encouragement is. You can't fulfill it. We're not going to tie the child down and say, we're not doing that. But this is the guidelines for your encouragement. In other words, the obligation is more on you as a parent than it is on the child, right? And obviously, you also have an obligation to protect your child's health. That's obvious. As we're going to see, when it's not a question of even being sick, if the sickness is, then for sure not. Even if a child's weak. We're going to see in the Shulchan Aruch that today, we consider all children to be in the category of weak children. In the category of weak children. Because they learn Torah all day and therefore they're weaker. They're in school all day. Back in the old day, they were running around all day. So they may be healthier. I'm just saying, sick here doesn't mean the kid's lying in bed, that's for sure. Even just a weaker child in general, there are more leniencies. We'll see that when we get tomorrow when we get to the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so now let's see this. Let's compare these statements, the two views, Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, and Rabbi Yochanan, with that of our Mishnah. Let's see how they align. Where am I? Here. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah. Hatinoikes children, we don't compel them to fast Yom Kippur on Yom Kippur. Ava, but they are trained lefnei shana, prior to a year, or lefnei shtayim, and prior to 2 years. This is what the Mishnah said. So the Gemara is going to say, sorry? So which one does it align with? Which one would it be? Let's think about this. Which one would it be? How would we make this into two tracks that match any of the views above? So the Gemara says like this. Bishlim Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. We can make it work for Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. Because Rav Huna and Rav Nachman both agree, right, that there's a minimum of there's always 2 years of training prior to complete fast. And there is at least 1 year of complete fast prior to the biblical fast, right? If the child is weaker, correct? So let's take this weaker child. 1 year before the bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah, they're doing a complete fast. 2 years, partial fast. 3 years before, also partial fasts. So now let's see. If that's the case, says the Gemara, we can make this entire Mishnah work for one person without any redundancy. As follows. When we say prior to 1 year and prior to 2 years, we mean not 1 year in advance, but prior to the 1 year in advance. That would be 2 years in advance. Now, 2 years in advance of your rabbinic obligation to fast is 3 years before your biblical obligation to fast. Because there's always 1 year of rabbinic obligation to fast. Follow? And therefore, lefnei shana, prior to 1 year, l'divrei, and to the rabbinic fast, which means you have 2 years of training, because prior to the year before your rabbinic obligation, so that's 2 years, which is ulefnei shtayim l'divrei, which is prior to 2 years, i.e. 3 years before your biblical obligation to fast. So, sorry? Means biblically. That's how Rashi explains it. We're learning like Rashi now, even though there's other ways of learning this Gemara. Yeah, the Bach changed it to Divrei Torah. Make it more clear, yeah. But The point is that in this view, it's not like Rav Chizda, who said earlier that when the Mishnah said prior to 1 year and prior to 2 years, it's talking about two different tracks, for a healthier child or for a weaker child. The Gemara is saying that following Rav Hunan and Nachman, this prior to 1 year or prior to 2 years is actually talking about one and the same thing and one at the same time. It's just prior to two different stages. Prior to the year before your rabbinical obligation, which is prior to 2 years of your biblical obligation. Following? No, there is a distinction. And the Mishnah is talking about a weaker child. The Mishnah is speaking of a weaker child. And that the weaker child begins to start his or her practicing prior to 1 year, i.e. 2 years before the rabbinic obligation to fast, which is prior to 2 years, i.e. 3 years before the biblical obligation to fast, which is one of the same year, at the age of either 9 or 10. It's a boy or a girl. They do, but the Mishnah is not talking about that. The Mishnah is talking about the healthy. They agree there's a distinction between healthy and unhealthy. We've talked about that already. But the Mishnah is speaking about one and the same person, one and the same year, which is the unhealthy child who begins, or the weaker child who begins 3 years before they turn bar bat mitzvah, which is 2 years prior to their rabbinic fast. Clear? And if we're Rabbi Yochanan, but according to Rabbi Yochanan, Kashya, the question becomes, what is our Mishnah talking about? You could not explain it. According to Rav Nachman, first of all, there is no rabbinic fast, right? So it's not as if you can say 2 years prior to your rabbinic fast, which is 3 years prior to your biblical fast, because there is no distinction between biblical and rabbinic. So you have to resort to the fact, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that the Mishnah is speaking of two tracks, one for the healthy and one for the unhealthy, right? Because otherwise, how do you have 1 year, which is 2 years prior to the rabbinic, and 3 years prior to the biblical? There is no rabbinic fast. But the Mishnah doesn't say what age. It says before 1 year or before 2 years. Right? Each one respective to when they turn biblical. But it's still a question of either prior to 1 year or prior to 2 years. So you have to say it's two different tracks. Okay. Now, according to Rabbi Yochanan, what was the maximum amount of time of training? For a healthy child, 2 years of training. For a weaker child, 1 year of training. Now, if the Mishnah means prior to 1 year or prior to 2 years, you have a minimum of 2 year training or 3 year training. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan does not say there's 2 or 3 year training. So neither the explanation we gave before to Rav Hunan and Nachman work, neither does Rav Chizda's explanation. Rav Chizda, who made the distinction between the two statements in the Mishnah, prior to 1 year is a weaker child, prior to 2 years is a stronger child. Rabbi Yochanan says the weaker child only does 1 year of hours, not 2 years. And the healthier child does 2 years of fasting, of practice fasting or partial fasting, not 3 years. Whereas the Mishnah gives the options of either 2 years or 3 years. Considering that we're translating the Mishnah to mean prior to 1 year, i.e. 2 years, prior to 2 years, i.e. 3 years. And Rabbi Yochanan only gives the options of either 1 year or 2 years. So Rabbi Yochanan would have to respond to you. What does it mean prior to 1 year, prior to 2 years? It doesn't mean, as we have been translating till now, prior to 1 year means 2 years, and prior to 2 years means 3 years, but rather samuch l'pirkan. It means straight preceding the time they're required to fast, meaning to say, lefnei shana does not mean prior to 1 year, but it means a year in advance. Prior to 2 years, lefnei shatayim doesn't mean prior to 2 years, it means 2 years in advance, which is exactly what the Rabbi Yochanan said. Healthier child is 2 years in advance, and a weaker child does 1 year in advance. Is that clear? Okay. Now the Gemara introduces a text which actually uses the language of Rabbi Yochanan. Namely, the text does not say the word lefnei, doesn't say the word prior, which makes it clear. 1 year, 2 years. As we shall see, Tashma, come and listen. The Tani Rabbi bar Shmuel, they taught in the house of Rabbi, they taught in the study house of Rabbi, son of Shmuel, to Noika's children, one does not compel them to fast in Yom Kippur, but they are trained. Training, as we said, means partial fasting. Shana, a year, a shtayim, or 2, samuch l'pirkan, close to when they become obligated biblically. So here the text explicitly leaves out the word lifnei, the word prior, thus making it clear. It means 1 year or 2 years in advance. So Bishlim al Rabbi Yochanan, this matches exactly as Rabbi Yochanan says, Nicha, it's all well, because he is the one who's of the view that is indeed only 1 or 2 years in advance, not 3 or 4 years in advance. Or not 2 years, which is 3 years in advance. Right? Which is what, like 2 years before the rabbinic, which is 3 years before the biblical, according to Rav Nachman and Rav Huna. However you want to say it. Do you want to say it's 1 track? Do you want to say it's 2 track? Either ways, figure out that it does not mean prior to the year. Right? Which makes it clear that it's actually 2 tracks, either a year before or 2 years before. But that's it. Because the word lefnei, the word prior, has been omitted here. So you can't read into it that prior to the year before actually means 2 years, as we've been explaining it for Rav Nachman and Rav Huna, which is prior to 2 years, i.e. 3 years before your biblical. We've dropped all of that because the word lefnei is taken out. Right? And therefore, let's get to that. Let's get to that in a second. El Rav Nachman, El Rav Huna Rav Nachman, but according to Rav Huna Rav Nachman, Kasha, this text is unclear. Even if you were to say that it's talking about before the rabbinic fast, nonetheless, you would still need at least 2 years before the rabbinic fast, whereas this track only gives 1 or 2 years, not 2 or 3 years, as Rav Huna Rav Nachman had required. So it says the Gemara, these 2 scholars, Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, will tell you, my chinuch, what does education mean? Nami de katani, that has been taught in this case. Hashlama means completion to do a full fast rabbinically. In other words, like this. Our Mishnah, when it says mechanchanoisai, we train children, it means training. Training means you're not doing the whole thing. It means you're only doing partial fasts. And in Rav Huna and Rav Nachman's view, partial fasts are a 2-year minimum, and that 2 years is either either it's 2 and 3 years before bar bat mitzvah, or it's 3 and 4 years prior to bar bat mitzvah, whether it's a healthier child or not a healthy child. But it has to be 2 years of partial training. But according to Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, there's also a question of, do you have 1 year rabbinic training, of 1 year rabbinic complete fast, or 2 years of rabbinic complete fast? There's always 2 years of partial training, which is what our Mishnah referred to. But there was also a question of, do you have 1 year of rabbinic fasting, if it's a weaker child, or 2 years of rabbinic fasting, if it's a healthier child? Clear? Right? This is Rav Nachman and Rav Huna's view, which would push back or bring forward the 2 years of partial hours. Right? Is that clear? Right? Because there's 2 issues. There's always 2 years of partial training according to partial hours according to Rav Nachman and Rav Huna. Partial hours. Partial fasting. Incomplete fasts. It's always 2 years of that. The question is, when does the 2 years start? But the rabbinic complete fast, either 2 if it's healthy, or 1 if it's unhealthy. So says the Gemara that this other text which says that there's either 1 year or 2 years of training prior to the biblical fast, that's a reference to there's either 1 year of rabbinic fasting or 2 years of rabbinic fasting. It's not referring to the same education of our Mishnah, which is talking about the incomplete fast, which that incomplete fast is always 2 years, but those 2 years either begin 4 years before bar mitzvah, or starts 3 years before bar mitzvah. And the Mishnah is referring to when it starts 3 years before bar mitzvah. Is that clear? Because the Mishnah is talking about a weaker child. And therefore for the Mishnah, it's only 3 years before bar mitzvah that we begin these partial hours of fasting. But this other text that we just introduced from Rabbi Bar Shmuel, which takes out the word lefnei, which takes out the word prior, and just says there's a training of either 1 year or 2 years before actual bar mitzvah, that's not talking about partial fasting, it's talking about rabbinic complete fasting. Either 1 year for an unhealthier child, or 2 years for a stronger child. Quite the brain twister. So now the Gemara says, would we refer to education? That's the word we're using here, education, acclamation, as complete fasting? Seemingly the word acclamation implies you're not doing the whole thing. Right? So the text that we just suggested of Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, would understand it to mean that the text is talking about complete fast, rabbinic, either 1 year or 2 years, uses the word chinuch, uses the word acclamation. And seemingly, acclamation does not apply to complete fasts. V'hatanya, we have a proof to this. What do we refer to when we say the word chinuch, when we say education or acclamation? If the child is accustomed to eating the second hour of the day, make them eat the third hour of the day. If the child is accustomed to eating at the fourth, if the child is accustomed to eating at the third hour, make them eat the fourth hour. In other words, clearly the word chinuch means acclamation, doing partial fast, and that you push off their meal by training them to contain themselves and eat a little less that day, or eat a little later that day. And therefore, if the text refers to 1 or 2 years prior to bar mitzvah with the word chinuch, with the word education, it cannot be talking about a complete fast. It must be talking about partial fast. Supportive of Rabbi Yochanan, which undermines Rav Hunan and Rav Nachman's understanding of this text. Because Rav Hunan and Rav Nachman say that partial hours always begins at least 2 years before the actual biblical time, because there's a rabbinic one in the middle, at least one. Okay? That's right. That's correct. Even Rav Hunan and Rav Nachman's own statement, when they refer to the partial fast, they use the word chinuch, acclamation, and when they refer to their biblical fast, they use the word mashlimin, complete it. Whereas this text describes the year or 2 years before bar mitzvah with the word chinuch, acclamation, which would imply only partial fasts. Whereas partial fasts, according to Rav Hunan and Nachman, never start the year before, at least 2 years before, or even 3 years if it's a healthier child. Amar Rava bar Ula, Rabbi son of Ula says, today, chanuchi have. The word education is a relative term that can be used in context to say different things. Education could either mean acclamation, and if that's the case, we mean partial fast, or education could mean preparation. And in preparation for your biblical fast, you're doing a rabbinic fast. So the term chinuch, rehearsal, that's a good word. Either it means acclamation or rehearsal. If it means rehearsal, as it does in that other text, then it's either 1 year before or 2 years before. 1 year of rehearsal rabbinically if you're a weaker child, 2 years of rehearsal if it's a healthier child. And then our Mishnah, which refers to either 3 years in advance, 2 years in advance of your rabbinic, which is 3 years in advance of your biblical, is referring to a weaker child, and it's talking about the 2 years of acclamation in which they do partial fasting. Okay. Now, the conclusion of all of this is the two opinions still remain the same. Rabbi Yochanan to the view that there's no such thing as rehearsal. There's no such thing as complete fast prior to biblical. It's just a question of either 1 or 2 years of partial fasting. Whereas Rav Hunan and Rav Nachman say there's always 2 years of partial fasting. The question is, after 2 years of partial fasting, do you have 2 years of rehearsal or 1 year of rehearsal? So is your total training 3 years in advance or 4 years in advance? That's the only question according to Rav Hunan and Rav Nachman. So those are the two views. And God willing, tomorrow we'll look at the Alter Shulchan Aruch and we'll get practical law on this question. Yeah.
Their job is to explain the law.
Yeah.
They're not explaining the law here. Why didn't they just say a girl at 12 years old must fast, a boy at 30 years old has to fast?
They said that.
Okay? And guide yourself accordingly. Teach your children accordingly.
Everything that's in
each kid is different.
So law by definition, especially Jewish law, but any law by definition is all built around precise demarcations. That's what all law is. If you ever listen to a lawyer talk about a case, it's all about what was the word used in that text and how can we demark that? How exactly do you define that word? And was the person exactly in violation of that word or in line with that word, right? So you have to get as precise as you possibly can whenever you're defining law. So if we're telling a parent you are obligated to educate your child, well, give me an exact line. Tell me exactly what I have to do to educate my child. And therefore, that's what we're doing. We're giving you an exact line. But while we're doing that, we're also telling you, take into consideration your child's health, right? Because if we didn't give an exact line, then the person would never know what's the expectation and what are my obligations. So it's a funny thing. Usually, actually, there's an exact line, and you either crossed it or didn't cross it. Whereas over here, we do give an exact line. At the same time, we tell you, make sure your child's still healthy, right? But legalities have to always be precise. They can't be leave it to your discretion. It's not a legal definition. Discretion is not legal. It's not a legal definition. So when you're giving a legal obligation for education, we have to put a line down. But at the same time, we're telling the parent, be a little smart about it. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the brain twist of this Gemara. So then, of course, that's the Gemara already said. If the child's unhealthy, you don't make them right. As I mentioned, even when the Gemara here said that a sick child gets less training, it's not talking about a sick child. It's talking about a weaker child. And as I said, our children today are technically considered weak by Jewish law, as we'll see tomorrow. Okay? All right, have a wonderful day, everybody.